Route 2. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they took me straight to what I assumed to be our family's personal doctor, because it was the same woman as last time. After an intense conversation, or so I assumed from the tone, she ran what I looked to be was every test she could on me, including not only a series of tests on the bugs in my body, but a brain scan. To be honest, that was still weird to me, in a way. The technology in this world, I mean. I didn't have anyone to blame for it but myself, really, for making assumptions. But my family's home had seemed to be very old-fashioned. All lacquered wood and sparsely decorated rooms, surrounded by strange forests filled with natural and artificial bug mounds and countless traps. It was a dangerous, foreboding place filled with countless strange bug species and odd facilities. There was a training area deep in the woods, where some of my distant family members would spar with live weapons, clashing with knives and swords and swarms of bugs, until a victor was decided. While it wasn't often they did so in the house, they wielded magical powers, carrying around scrolls that were somehow bigger on the inside and walking up walls and more. And I guess that on some level, I'd figured that I was in some kind of fantasy world, maybe one resembling ancient city-states or something stranger. So it came as quite a surprise when one day, shortly after my birth, my mother went into the storehouse, came out carrying a box, and unpacked an old TV. Really, my first clue should have been the giant walk-in refrigerator that seemed to service my entire extended family. But I guess on some level, I'd written that off as a natural thing to do with magic if you could, in a way that just didn't apply to a whole-ass television set. Really, in hindsight, it seemed like my father's family was just a bit old-fashioned, which might have been why my mother had only recently moved in with him, or so I assumed from the boxes she was slowly unpacking at least. An elderly man who might have been my grandfather came around periodically to stay with me when my parents had to go out, and always seemed to stop to look at the changes disapprovingly, though he never seemed to say or do anything about it. But they had a TV, a refrigerator, even a landline phone and VCR. We didn't have a computer, but mostly because my father didn't seem to trust the technology. My mother had pointed one out when they were carrying me through a store, and he looked very skeptical. I wasn't sure if that meant he was behind on the times or if my mother was an early adopter. When did home computers become commonplace on Earth beds? In the 80s or 90s? I'd been young enough when DVDs replaced VHS tapes on Earth bed that I barely remembered having one. But then, I was a baby right now. In 18 years, the tech level of this world might be about the same as Earth beds, or maybe just a decade off from it, if with some oddities here and there. All of which was to say, it was a little off-putting when the magic doctor held a glowing green hand over me, checked my chakra system and organs with her powers, and then gave me an MRI. Then they took me home. Unless the magic part quickened things, it should be a week or two before the blood work and scans came back. And once we were back, they hovered. Before, I'd been able to get away with a lot by just sleeping for a bit and not making noise when I woke up. And even when they were around, I could get away with circulating my chakra. And it seemed like something was going on that kept pulling me farther away. But now, one of them was always with me, awake even through the night. Out of curiosity, I gathered and circulated my chakra again anyway, just to see what they would do. But they didn't stop me. They just looked nervous. My father paced a lot. My mother unpacked a box of old clothes she'd ignored for 5 months and began to sew the holes in them closed. And I kept doing what I was doing, because working out was my nervous habit. And I was nervous, because I already knew what they'd find, which was another part of why the tests were off-putting. I'd had scans like these taken in my previous life too, during my time with the wards. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, there it was, front and center in the test results. Pictures of my corona palencia taken from every possible angle. There was that same cloudiness as in my first life, where it expanded like a kind of web into the meninges around my brain, touching on different parts. The doctor seemed out of her depth until my father spoke. I couldn't tell what he was saying, but his words were guarded and tense. Then the doctor just looked skeptical, They exchanged words for a while, quickly going beyond my ability to guess, but I was pretty sure they were talking about either my powers or my chakra control. Then my father called a bug to his hand, and then put the other in front of it, as if to hide it from me, before he began to speak softly, cooing. I didn't understand the words, but it was still obvious what he wanted. I decided to go along with it. It would be a lie to say I wasn't worried about what could happen if I did. I didn't know if this world had any other parahumans or not, much less if they were known. But if they did, there were a lot of countries on Earth that did pretty scary things to newfound parahumans, like China and Russia. And even in America, it would generally mean monitoring and pressure. But right now, in my eyes, the worst case scenario was that they didn't, and he took it as just a tumor and tried to remove it. Because that wouldn't go well for any of us. I manipulated the bug to fly over to me and land on my finger. My father said something and the doctor still looked skeptical. I drew more out from his body and had them circle above me in a rough sphere. My father got a chakra in his right hand and then extended his left, gesturing for the swarm to come there, and I moved the swarm to him as bid. The doctor began to murmur something, and I tried to gauge whether she was convinced or not from her expression and the reactions of the bugs I'd planted on her body. Still not enough? I released my father's swarm, then I called out my own swarm, summoning them into a cloud above my body. I spoke through my swarm, forming the words through the fluttering of their wings, the rustling of their shells and their chirps. I went with a word my father had said over and over before, which I assumed to be something like Dada. The doctor looked promptly and thoroughly freaked out. I stopped. Then my father gathered chakra and I did the same, doing my exercises. The doctor passed her glowing hands over me and didn't seem to believe it. Checked again and still didn't. Then she was in motion and I largely lost track of the conversation as she paced and seemed to propose ideas. She had a whiteboard and wrote something on it. Then she pointed at the brain scan, indicating different sections, and I still didn't understand the words, but I'd had this particular conversation before. Roots or veins connected my corona pollentia to my cerebellum and frontal lobe. They might not know it, but that was indicative of master powers and finger perception powers. They kept using a word I didn't understand, something like Kekigenkai? Kekigenkai? It was still hard for me to tell what words were separate or compound in this language, maybe because the sentence structure was different, but I memorized the word to look up its meaning later. In the end, my father had another solemn conversation with the doctor, who nodded, and then we went home again. I had a feeling we'd be back. After that, my schooling began in earnest, particularly when it came to trying to teach me how to talk, which was something I actually appreciated. My parents continued to monitor me carefully, but still didn't stop me from practicing, which was a plus. They didn't hand me over to the government either, which was also nice. My father would put a hand on my head when he saw me doing it, presumably to monitor me and make sure I didn't hurt myself. Mother did more sewing and my father did more pacing. They didn't take me out much anymore. They seemed to want to keep my powers secret, at least outside the house, which I'd intended to do anyway. But other than that, things basically returned to normal, aside from the increased lessons. I'd been trying to learn the language all along, so with added help, it didn't take too long for me to start picking up more basic concepts. At first, my father would point at things and say the word, and I'd repeat it back through my swarm. But soon I'd point at things I didn't know the name of and he'd give the word for it. I cheated a bit to make things go faster too, the same way I'd quickly taught myself Braille during my time with the wards. I wasn't sure about the specifics of it, especially with what happened, and it could have been just a very useful mnemonic device. But my guess was that in the same way that different types of memories were stored in different parts of the brain, my memories of my power were stored by my passenger. The human brain could store more than you might think, but it probably wasn't up to storing the combined experiences of millions or billions or, in one particular case, septillions of bugs. So it probably filed those away on the passenger side instead of on mine. Put simply, if I memorized something with my power, such as by writing the same words out in both this language and English, I usually didn't forget about it afterwards. Which I figured was how I taught myself to understand English through my bug's distorted senses in about a month too. Before long, I thought I had a reasonable grasp of the language. A better grasp really than I entirely let on. Because it was amazing what people would say when they thought you couldn't hear or understand them. I had a feeling that they were keeping track of what words they taught me, at least subconsciously. But as my grasp of the language grew, it wasn't just them I listened to. I eavesdropped on the hundreds of conversations going on out in the streets too. In particular, there was a conversation between my father and the man I assumed to be my grandfather that took my interest. Are you still kina ni iru what happened to anata no ryori yoji? My grandfather said. It was his choice and the will of Sonone. A word I didn't know. A name, maybe of a person, or maybe of an organization. They asked Usogiri much. My father said. It was hard to tell a stone through my swarm, especially with the swarm inside him. And my father kept his voice tightly under control besides, but I could feel his physical reactions too. He may not have been angry exactly, but he was at least bitter. She's a tensai. A word I'd heard a lot lately, in a lot of different tones. Tensai, heaven gift, or genius. My grandfather said, the future of our clan. So were, my father said two more words, which I assumed to be names. Shukuru and Yoji, geniuses, the future of the Aburame, taken away and lost. A complicated term that seemed to hold weight. Daisanji Ninkai Taisen? I only vaguely recognized the first and last words from their component parts. Daisanji. San was free. Dai and Ji were modifiers. The third something Tyson. Big battle? War? The third war? I felt a chill. Not the First World War, surely. Is over, my grandfather said. The stone was mixed, complicated, and the way my bugs heard things didn't help. At a guess, relieved, exhausted, angry, and disapproving, all in one. She will be safe. I was a child during the Second War, my father said. And another word I didn't know, but similar enough to put together. Sandaime, the free. Another incremental word, just for a different context. How many words do you need for first? The third said it would be the end then too. They were both silent for a while. Will you tell? My father began, followed by the name of a group of some kind that I couldn't parse. I was a boy when the First War ended. My grandfather parroted back. And yet... But remember, boy, the sun shines through the clouds. It can't be hidden by the leaves either. Please don't use poetic phrases, I thought. This is tough enough as is. My grandfather left then, having apparently said his piece, while my father was left looking tired. I'm sorry, Tora, he said, and for a moment I wondered if he knew I could understand it. It never seems to be a good time to be a genius.